the 4-hour time frame in the bottom left, the 15-minute in the top right, and the 1-minute chart in the bottom right. Now, let's imagine that our higher time frame is the daily, our medium time frame is the 4-hour, and our lower time frame is the 15-minute. Now, if you want to use the 1 minute for your lower time frame execution, then perhaps the 4-hour would be your higher time frame and the 15-minute would be your medium time frame, so your intraday bias. Okay, so we're just going to look at these 4 time frames for now. We're going to start on the higher time frame, so the daily. We're going to work our way down all the way into the 1 minute, just applying all of that theory and those concepts that we've just been through, just to see how it all comes together in reality. And we're also going to have a look at a few trade examples as well. So let's get into it, and we'll start with the daily time frame. So the first thing that we want to ask ourselves is, are we bullish or bearish? And I think we can all agree just by looking at this chart, it's clearly bearish, right? Making a nice, pretty clean sequence of lower lows and lower highs. So I'm just loosely drawing what I deem to be the swing structure on the daily time frame. Now, of course, some of you may have mechanical pip rules for the daily chart, which is great. But I'm just going to apply a little bit of discretion here, and I can see that that's clearly a swing pullback on the daily time frame. Right, we had a nice impulsive run followed by a corrective pullback, followed by another impulsive run to the downside, right? So it's about as clean as it gets, really. So I'm quite happy to call that my daily swing low. And as you can see, we had a daily break of swing structure here. So daily boss. Following the boss, we can then look back and we can now find our confirmed swing high, which would be there. Okay, so we have our daily swing high. I'm just going to mark that with that line there, just so that we've got our range, daily swing high. Okay, after that daily breaker structure, you can see that price did start to pull back, but it was a pretty shallow pullback, right? And then we had another movement to the downside, but notice how price failed to break and close below this low here, right? Which was the start of that first pullback. So we have what's called a liquidity grab, which again, we haven't covered yet, but some of you may be familiar with that, right? We've had a daily liquidity grab, which has then fueled this next move higher. So what I'm going to do is just quickly mark that as a daily liquidity grab. Put my little fancy liquidity sign there, right? So if we just focus on this internal piece of price action quickly, what we can see is that the daily time frame started to pull back a little bit. We had a movement to the downside, and then you can see we had this movement to the upside. Of course, all contained still within this swing range. So this is internal structure, but what we can see is that we now have internal structure to work with. So we have a bullish IBOS, right? So what that confirms to us is that the internal structure has now switched bullish, which confirms the start of the swing pullback, right? So I'm now quite happy to call that my daily swing low. Again, you might measure that and say, okay, well, that's a significant pullback on the daily time frame, so I'm happy to call that my swing low as well. So we know that the internal structure has now switched bullish. So that means that this daily weak swing low is in fact actually a strong internal low. Now, sometimes structure is going to be misaligned, but if it is misaligned, just remind yourself that swing is king, right? It's always going to take precedence over internal structure, okay? So yes, the internal structure has switched bullish, but it's likely just switched bullish to facilitate this swing pullback, okay? So price has now pulled back into an area of value, okay? So we're not really going to get into like supply and demand and premium versus discount and liquidity and all that good stuff, because I want to save that for another video. But essentially price has now pulled back into a high probability daily supply zone, and we've seen a pretty decent reaction. So it's possible that the daily objective is now complete because we've mitigated a high value area here on the daily time frame. But we also need to be aware in the back of our minds that, of course, the internal structure is bullish and can stay bullish, right, to potentially mitigate, like the extreme of this leg. And it's not until we get a bearish IBOS that then confirms the end of the swing pullback, right? So that's always a possibility. But as I say, if structure is misaligned, just remind yourself that, swing is king. And particularly if price has mitigated, a high value area on that specific time frame, then it's very possible this internal trend will then switch bearish because price has more than likely completed its mission, okay? So This high is in fact a weak internal high, and this low here, although it's a weak swing low, it's actually a strong internal low. Okay, so that's the daily chart. Let's now go down to the 4 hour. I'm just going to make sure that that's on the 4 hour. Right, so let's have a look at the 4 hour chart. So if we just zoom out a little bit here, we can see that, let's just focus on this recent piece of price here just to kind of speed this up a little bit. But, that's a pretty significant 4 hour swing pullback. So I'm happy to call that a 4 hour swing pullback. And as you can see, we get a 4 hour break of swing structure just here, okay? Which means that we then look back and we find the highest point that led to the break, which of course is this high there. So that's our 4 hour strong swing high. And then we start to pull back, we get a pretty decent pullback here on the 4 hour time frame. And this move here breaks, this level of structure and this supply zone. So it's a pretty decent 4 hour pullback. So I'm quite happy to call that my 4 hour swing low. So as you can see, the 4 hour internal trend on the 4 hour chart remains bullish and eventually takes out the strong 4 hour swing high. Okay, so now the 4 hour trend, if I just in fact get rid of that for a second, the 4 hour trend has now switched bullish, which as we know was also a daily bullish IBOS. Okay, so where's our swing low? Well, it remains the same, okay, because that's the lowest point that led to the break. So after that break of structure, we then get a little pullback here on the 4 hour, but to be honest, that doesn't really look like swing structure to me relative to these, other swings in price. So that would just be internal structure. We then have another pretty decent move to the upside. Let's look left. What are we reacting to? Okay, well, we've come into this supply range, okay? We've started to react. And as you can see, we then have a pretty aggressive move to the downside, breaking this internal low. So let's mark this out. So we have a bearish IBOS there. So H for IBOS. Okay, so now the internal structure has switched bearish. So I'm quite happy to call that my 4 hour swing high, right? So if I just put that little dot there just to keep it all nice and clean, right? So we know that the 4 hour swing structure is bullish. So this being our 4 hour strong swing low, this being our weak 4 hour swing high, but we know that the internal structure has now switched bearish, okay? So it's not until the 4 hour internal trend then switches bullish again, and we get that bullish IBOS that confirms the end of the swing pullback. Now, this is again the beauty of multi-time frame analysis, right? Because we know that the daily swing trend is bearish, and now the 4 hour internal trend has also switched bearish, okay? Now, of course, we need to be mindful that this is a strong 4 hour swing low, and the 4 hour trend is still bullish. And yep, the 4 hour may come down here to this extreme, and this is potentially where the 4 hour high low will form to go on to take out that weak swing high. But we also know that the daily time frame has mitigated a pretty decent area, premium level of supply, and we've seen a very aggressive reaction from that level. So it's possible that now the internal trend will remain bearish until we take out this strong 4 hour swing low. But of course, we also know that it's a weak daily swing low, okay? And of course, the daily is more powerful than the 4 hour time frame. So we just need to manage our expectations. So basically, you can start to build a case for both long and shorts because, of course, structure is out of alignment. You've got a daily swing trend, which is bearish. You've got the 4 hour swing trend, which is bullish. But now when you start to piece everything together, and you're like, okay, well, price has now mitigated a pretty decent area on the daily. The internal structure has switched bearish. We've seen a ton of momentum, which has led to this, pretty decent break of 4 hour internal structure. And now price is just correcting sideways. What do we know about the natural progression of the market? Price typically moves in an impulse corrective fashion, right? So it's very possible that actually we see an impulse, a correction, and that continuation, and then the 4 hour swing trend switches bearish, okay? So yeah, that's the 4-hour chart. Let's now go to the M15. So let's just open this up. And again, what we need to do is just look left to build the story, to establish whether or not we're bullish or bearish, and to really know where our accurate swing highs and swing lows are, okay? So what we'll do is just look left a little bit. So just up here, that would be the 4-hour week internal high. So, that's a pretty clear M15 swing pullback, right? So I'm quite happy to call that an M15 swing pullback, M15 swing high. We pull back, and then we get an M15 break of swing structure over here. So M15 boss, right? So where's our swing low? Well, of course, this is the lowest point that led to the break. So our M15 swing range is from this low to this high, right? So as you can see, after that break of structure, we get pretty expansive move to the upside, and then price starts to correctively pull back. So let me just have a quick look where we pull back to. Okay, yeah, so we pull back to the EQ of that range. We also mitigate this prior demand range as well. And then as you can see, after pulling back to the prior range, price fails to take out the weak swing high. And then we see a pretty aggressive sell-off. I can't quite remember what that was, but I think it was CPI news or something like that. But yeah, we then get a really aggressive move to the downside. And then as you can see, the M15 swing trend switches bearish. So let me just get rid of that. And then we will mark on our M15 break of swing structure like that. Okay, so this high up here, as we know, it was a weak 4-hour internal high. Okay, but it now becomes our strong M15 swing high. Okay, because that's the highest point before the break. So we continue to trickle lower, and now this looks like a pretty significant pullback here on the M15. Again, if it just helps, you can always measure it, right? So you can measure it from the low to the high, and that's over 65 pips. So it's a sizable pullback as far as the M15 is concerned. So I'm quite happy to call that an M15 swing pullback, right? So at this point, we're playing within a pretty large M15 range, okay? So let's play a few more candles forward just so that we've got a little bit more structure to work with. Right, so let's have a quick look there. As you can see, price hasn't actually broken and closed below the low yet, right? So if you can just see from the crosshair, if I just zoom in there a little bit, you can see that price has failed to break and close below the low. So now it looks like, okay, so we've just broken below that M15 swing low. So if we are being 100% mechanical, you can see that this candle here has now, the body of that candle has broken and closed below our swing low, which means that we can now find our new swing high. So that being this high there, right? That's the highest point before the break. So now we're playing within this new M15 swing range. So if I just mark this as our strong M15 swing high, okay, so we don't know where our swing low is at the moment because of course we need to wait for structure to develop. So just looking at the M15 time frame alone, you could potentially look for some shorts from this whole supply range, okay, if you wanted to. Or of course you can wait for price to mitigate this supply range, jump into the 1 minute, and then wait for the 1 minute time frame to shift bearish, right? And then of course you can use the 1 minute just for that added accuracy and timing, and of course increase your risk to reward. All right, now that is not the most convincing break, so I'd be a little bit cautious, but being 100% mechanical, it is a confirmed break of swing structure, meaning that we now have our new strong M15 swing high. Okay, so let's just play a few more candles forward, right? So we mitigate that M15 supply zone. It doesn't look like we come to that refined candle there, so we actually just mitigate those buy to sell wicks by the looks of things. Okay, and price has currently failed to take out the low, and now as you can see the internal structure has shifted bullish, right? So now we have a bullish IBOS on the M15, right? So now that confirms the start of the M15 swing pullback, but notice how, first of all, it's super impulsive. Second of all, that's not the most convincing breaker structure. Third of all, we failed to take out this low again, right? So, I wouldn't now be surprised if the swing trend switched bullish, okay? Now, it's not until we get a bearish IBOS that confirms the end of the swing pullback, right? So let's just play a few more candles forward. Right, it's a big move, right? Breaking that high. So now the M15 has switched bullish. No surprise there, really. Okay, so now the M15 has switched bullish. We can look for reasons to get long, playing this pro trend M15 move, right? Because the M15 has switched bullish. Now, we're also aware of the bigger picture. Let's just quickly hop back to our other timeframes, right? So we go back to the 4 hour. We know that the internal structure on the 4 hour has switched bearish. So just thinking about what's happening on the 4 hour from an internal perspective and the M15. Now the M15 has switched bullish, right? Even if we're to get long playing that M15 pro trend move, even if we can get in long just to play that 4 hour internal pullback, right? Because it's possible that, the 4 hour pullback into this supply zone here before continuing lower, potentially into the extreme of this 4 hour swing leg. And then let's see what happens, right? So as we know, the M15 swing trend has switched bullish. So, we've kind of got to ask ourselves, well, the M15 has switched bullish, but likely just to facilitate this 4 hour internal pullback, right? So go back to the M15. So in terms of the M15, we know that we switch bullish. This low then becomes our new strong protected swing low. Now within this leg of price, we've got a couple of zones. We've got this zone here, we've got this inside bar. It's not the best. And then we've also got the extreme down here. And pretty much everything below this extreme has been mitigated. So this is a super high probability POI to get long from. Okay, and just to kind of add a little bit of confluence to this zone, it also flipped this level of supply. And it also led to that internal break of structure, right? Taking out, multiple supply zones along the way. So, some big money stepped into the market here, leading to that M15 break swing structure as well. So it's a high probability POI to look for longs. Now, this is still valid. It's just about sat on the EQ of the leg. But I'd be very cautious that this zone here would be used as inducement for the extreme, okay? So let's just play a few more candles forward and see what happens. So if we just look at all of these candles here, right, we have a movement to the upside. We then have an internal pullback because that inside bar, if you were to look at the 1 minute, it would look something like this on the 1 minute, right? So we know that just by looking at that inside bar there on the 15 minute, it's more of a lower time frame pullback, right? So if price was to break that fractal low there, that would be a bearish change of character, right? Now, sometimes the fractal structure, so chock, and those larger internal pieces of structure are sometimes going to be the same, okay? Now, this is a pretty good example of that where we have, just pretty much one straight push with a very small fractal pullback in that leg, okay? So if price was to break that fractal low, that would be a bearish chock. And that would also be a pretty good signal that, we're going to come a little bit lower to potentially into this extreme, okay? So I'll just play a few more candles forward. So we initially react from this zone and, it's possible. Let's just take our premium versus discount. It's not quite on the EQ, right? So typically price does like to mitigate the EQ of a swing leg, and that hasn't quite happened yet. So there's always the possibility that this reaction from this demand is just to build liquidity to fuel some lower prices. So let's have a look at what happens. So this is pretty corrective price action. No surprise really throughout the Asian session. And then sort of coming into the start of London, as you can see, this demand now fails, right? So internal order flow is now bearish. That would be a bearish change of character. Okay. Now we have to ask ourselves, why has the internal structure switched bearish? Well, likely just to mitigate some discount demand within this swing leg, okay? So there's a couple of ways in which you could approach this. The first way is that if the M15 is your execution time frame, right? So your lower time frame, you could simply set a limit, right? You could set a buy limit on this POI like that, depending on what your rules are, right? So maybe you're going to go on the distal, maybe you're going to go on the EQ, depending on whatever your rules are. And then, the simple target, the logical target would be the M15 swing high, which I haven't marked. So that's our weak M15 swing high, because at the moment it's failed to put in a new low. So we are playing within this M15 bullish swing range, right? So now that prices come into the discount of this range, this is a pretty decent area to look for longs. So your first option, if the M15 is your execution time frame, you could literally set and forget an order on the extreme of this range, okay? Or what you could do is you could wait for price to mitigate it, if it was going to mitigate it, and then you could wait for an internal bullish breaker structure, because then the internal structure is aligned with the swing structure. So that just increases the probabilities a little bit more to confirm that, okay, this zone is going to hold. And then once the internal structure has switched bullish, we now have full structural alignment to target that weak swing high, right? So that's your second option. Of course, your third option is that once price mitigates this M15 demand zone, you can then jump into the 1 minute or a lower time frame than the M15, whether that's the M2 or the M5 or whatever. And then you can wait for a specific entry model from this zone here on the lower time frames. Or what you can do is, again, wait for the internal structure to switch bullish. You then have some fresh demand to work with, and then you could simply drop into the lower time frames once you have that freshly created fractal demand, okay? Using the 15-minute time frame. So you'd now be triggered into that trade. Notice how if you were to enter on the EQ of that zone, you would have been triggered, right? And of course, you would have had a bit of a tighter stop, something like that, 7 pips, targeting the weak high for almost 10R. Okay, so that's one way of entering on the M15, looking to play that pro trend M15 move, which, as we know, is likely just to play that 4-hour internal pullback as well. So let's just keep playing a few more candles forward. Let's see what happens if this zone. Okay, so now that zone has held, right? Now we've seen a pretty decent move from this level. So let's just get rid of that for a second, bring it across. So now what we can see is a bullish IBOS, right? So price has clearly broken that high there with a lot of momentum. So now we have true structural alignment with our internal and our swing, right? So probabilities have now increased. So that bullish IBOS confirms the end of the swing pullback. So now the probabilities are increased even more that this is the swing higher low in place, and we can now target that weak swing high with a lot more confidence. So as I was saying, right, because we have this bullish IBOS and we have this shift in internal structure, we now have new demand to work with, right? So we have this freshly created fractal demand. So again, just purely looking at the M15 timeframe alone, you could simply enter on this zone here, right? Just going on the distal again, targeting that weak swing high, something like that, okay? Absolutely fine. So what we'll do is we'll just see what happens there. Right, so you're now triggered into that trade. So that's now running. Okay, now as I say, if you want to take it that one step further, you can now drop into a lower time frame. So what we'll do now is have a look at the 1 minute and see how we could have got involved in this, right? After that bullish IBOS, once the internal structure has aligned itself with the swing structure, and yeah, we'll just see how we could have got involved in that particular trade. So I'm just going to make sure that everything is showing from a 1 minute perspective. And now we're going to hop to the M1, okay? So I'm not going to go through all of this because I'm conscious of your time and I don't want this video to be 4 hours long. But what you can see here is that this impulsive move higher on the 1 minute is what led to that M15 bullish IBOS. So if we just mark this on the 1 minute, so that's showing, and now we'll hop back to the M1, right? So price initially mitigated this discount demand, kind of messed around for a little bit, right? Obviously building liquidity, swept liquidity, and then eventually we saw that pretty impulsive move higher, leading to that M15 bullish IBOS. So now we have this newly created fractal demand to work with. So, if you were going to use the 1 minute for your lower time frame entry, you would literally set an alert on the edge of this zone, or maybe just in front, and then you'd wait for the 1 minute time frame to mitigate your zone. And then depending on what your entry model criteria is, you could then wait for a specific pattern to occur to see if you can use the 1 minute to position yourself in a long to catch that next M15 run to the upside. Okay, so let's just play a few more candles forward. Okay, so price has now mitigated our POI. Right, so as you can see, the 1 minute time frame, if I was just to draw this, using a line, for example, the 1 minute time frame is bearish, right? So as we know, what we need to wait for is the 1 minute time frame to shift bullish. Okay, so there's nothing at the moment, unless of course you were going to set a risk entry on a refined zone like that. But to be honest with you, it's pretty low probability because there's no inducement in this leg and the extreme is also still unmitigated. So yeah, setting a risk entry on that 1 minute sort of refined candle is pretty low probability as far as I'm concerned, but don't worry about that too much. So let's continue to play price forward. So at this point here, if I just zoom in, you can see that we just have what's called a change of character, right? So a chock. So that's the fractal structure in terms of the 1 minute shifting bullish. Okay, so here we've had a pretty decent sweep of liquidity. We have strong momentum coming out of our POI. So this is called a V-shaped reaction. And now we have a 1 minute change of character. So let me just continue to play price forward for a minute. Okay, so you could enter from this POI like that. It's pretty aggressive, and the reason why is because there's been no clear shift in order flow, right? We can see that this 1 minute supply range is still holding, and sometimes what you'll get is a change of character, and it's just a liquidity grab before price continues to move upside. And price is now sweeping this liquidity. We've had a pretty clear shift in order flow, right? So now price is just kind of pulling back. So now we have another clear POI to enter from, which is just slightly higher probability in my opinion, because now we have a clear shift in 1 minute order flow, and price is now starting to correctively pull back. So now we're just sort of building liquidity in front of this 1 minute demand zone. So we can look to enter from here with a 3 pip stop is absolutely fine. Now again, depending on your management rules, some people like to target a fixed 5R, which would be that. Some people like to target their nearest weak leg, which would be this high here. And of course, we can also target that weak M15 swing high with a lot more confidence because the internal structure has now shifted bullish in line with the swing. So we have almost an 18% trade there if this was to, of course, play out, right? So let's just see whether or not we get triggered into this position. So, okay, we haven't quite got triggered yet. Now, a couple of things here. Price may have just mitigated this M1 demand range, as you can see, right? And sometimes if you over refine your 1 minute zones like that, then sometimes you can miss trades, right? But of course, this move here might just be to build liquidity in front of the POI, right? So, in which case that would increase the probability of this zone even more because it has inducement in front of it. Now, don't worry, if you're not familiar with any of these terms that I'm going on about, inducement, supply and demand, and liquidity, and all of that good stuff. But of course, you can find out more about how we trade within our Zero to Hero course if you want to check out our platform. So let's just continue with this. Right, so price is correcting. We still have our order set on this 1 minute POI like so. Let's see what happens. Okay, so we would have now been triggered into the trade. Okay, so at that point there, again, if you were going on the EQ, you'd have an even tighter stop. You'd have a 2 pip stop or maybe a 1.5 pip stop. But to be honest, you don't need anything less than 2 pips, really. I think 3 pips for euro dollar is a great sweet spot if you're using the 1 minute time frame for your entries. So let's just put it back to how it was. We entered on the open of this POI, right, the distal, and now you can see that we've had a pretty decent move higher, taking out this high here. So for me personally, I'd be happy to remove my risk upon that structural break, right? So again, depending on your own management rules, you're going to manage this a million different ways, but here you can see that price has now met that internal week high, and we're continuing to push higher. So let's quickly hop back to the M15 and we'll continue playing this. So we have 3 entries, right? We have our first entry, which is essentially the lowest probability entry that we've discussed, because as you can see, internal structure and order flow is bearish. So essentially buying here is trading against that internal order flow and structure. Price then shifted bullish. We had our bullish IBOS, and then we have our second entry here, which is much higher probability as the internal structure is aligned with the swing structure. And then of course we dropped into the 1 minute just to refine that entry a little bit more, and then we waited for that 1 minute order flow and structure to shift bullish after mitigating this M15 POI, which is that third entry that we have running at the moment, right? So we have these 3 trades. Doesn't mean that you have to take all 3 of them, right? You just have to find what works for you. How aggressive or conservative do you want to be? How much confirmation do you want to have? Okay, so let's just continue to play this forward and see what happens. So nice move to the upside. We've had another internal break of structure here. So this low becomes a strong protected internal low. So again, maybe, you'd want to try and catch that next M15 internal high low. Who knows? Because we just expect these internal ranges to remain bullish until we take out that weak swing high. So let's just keep playing this, see what happens. Okay, wow. So there we go. We've now taken out that weak M15 swing high. So yeah, 3 great trade examples there, just to showcase how we can kind of start to piece all of these concepts together, just to understand how that framework really comes together in reality. So now that we've been through a couple of trade examples on the M15, I'm just going to quickly hop back to the 4-hour time frame, okay, before we wrap this video up.